Raphael, a titan of the Italian Renaissance, an artistic genius with elegant compositions that have permanently influenced Western art. And of course you must recognize such works such as the School of Athens, within which Raphael embodies these Renaissance principles of harmony, perspective, and intellectual magnificence, effortlessly merging technical proficiency with tranquil beauty. But his life was much more than just painting. He was also an accomplished architect, and he contributed to the construction of many notable structures, including even sections of St. Peter's Basilica in Vatican City. Thus his creative nature and engagements with contemporaries such as Leonardo da Vinci and Michelangelo enhanced his work, establishing him as a pivotal figure in the cultural renaissance of his era, and a legacy that lives on in his famous work. And a legacy that lives on in 2024 YouTube, where people like me make videos about him, and people like you come to watch them. If you're still listening, I hope the introduction was sufficient. But if you are, it's good to see you here again, or if you're a newcomer, it's good to meet you. As always, do you want to support the channel? You only need to click 2 buttons. It's the like and subscribe, and that's a pretty good deal for what you get out of it. Now, with that being said, I won't pressure you, but I will advise you to get nice and relaxed, because right now we begin the life of Raphael. And so we begin in Urbino, a pretty small but significant city in central Italy's March region, especially significant for art culture. Now, who was his father? It was one Giovanni Santi, and he served as the court painter to the Duke. So definitely coming from a background of artists, where painting runs in the blood. Now the court's esteemed reputation was established by one Federico de Montefeltro, a highly successful man who was appointed Duke of Urbino by Pope Sixtus IV himself. Now, this is because Urbino was part of the Papal States at the time. Now, Federico unfortunately passed away the year before Raphael was born. But although Federico's court emphasized literature over art, Giovanni Santi, the father of Raphael, was both a painter and a poet, and he was very good at both of them. In fact, he wrote a rhymed chronicle of Federico's life, and was involved in creating texts and decorations for the masque-like court entertainments, and there was certainly no shortage of them. Now his poem dedicated to Federico reveals this keen awareness of most of the advanced North Italian painters and early Netherlandish artists. In Urbino's intimate court setting, Giovanni was likely more integrated into the ruling family's inner circle than most court painters would have been at the time, and it certainly helps to have friends in high places. Now, Federico was succeeded by his son, Guidovaldo, who married Elisabetta Gonzaga, the daughter of the ruler of Mantua, a court which was renowned for its excellence in music and the visual arts among the smaller Italian states. And under their leadership, Urbino continued to be a center of this literary culture, and it was getting quite well known for it. Now, growing up in this kind of environment, you can certainly see what kind of effect it would have on a boy, especially one who had artistic sensibilities, and had certainly endowed Raphael with the excellent manners and social skills, as highlighted by his biographer Vasari. I'll get to a little bit of that later. Well, shortly after this period, Urbino's court life became the model for the virtues of the Italian humanist court, as depicted by Castiglione's classic work, The Book of the Courtier, which was published first in 1528. Now, Castiglione actually moved to Urbino in 1504, by which time Raphael was no longer based there, but he still did visit frequently, and the two of them had actually met up and became close friends. Raphael also formed strong friendships with other regular visitors to the court, such as Pietro Bibbiena, and Pietro Bembo. Now, both of these men, if you don't recognize the names, had actually gained quite a lot of recognition as writers, as was the style at the time, especially in Urbino and that part of the Papal States, but later they actually became cardinals, and when Raphael was in Rome, they were both there. Once again, helps to have friends in high places, especially in the papacy. Now, throughout his life, Raphael moved effortlessly within this setting of the high society of 16th century Italy, a trait that contributed to the perception that his career advanced with ease. Now, whether this be a slander from people who were just a little bit jealous, that remains to be seen. But either way, you get to where you need to go, however you can get there. Don't tell me you wouldn't do it. However, he did not receive a complete humanistic education that one might expect from someone who would come from these kinds of means and reputation, especially when it comes to Latin. Now, Latin was, at that time, something that you would really want to study. It was the language of God, right? All the Bibles were written in that, and being in Italy, you wanted to understand those old texts. So that would be the main topic that you would really pour a lot of your time into. But of course, not everybody was interested. Not everybody had the opportunity. Now, things weren't all fun and games growing up for Raphael. In fact, at only 8 years old, this is in the year 1491, his mother passed away. Now, regardless of the time period, regardless of it being 15th century, it's still a bit of an impact, especially on someone so young. And it didn't help either that 3 years later, August 1st, 1494, his father also passed away. Well, he had passed away after remarrying. And this, it effectively left Raphael as an orphan at the age of 11 years old. In fact, his only legal guardian became his paternal uncle, Bartolomeo, who was a priest who later engaged in legal disputes with Raphael's stepmother. Now, the young artist likely lived with his stepmother when he wasn't apprenticed to a master. According to Vasari, his biographer, Raphael had already shown talent at this time and was indeed a great help to his father. A self-portrait from his teenage years demonstrates this early aptitude, far beyond someone for his age. It appears that from a very young age indeed that Raphael had assisted in managing his father's workshop, probably alongside his stepmother. In Urbino, he encountered the works of Paolo Uccello, the former court painter who died in 1475, and Luca Signorelli, who lived in nearby Città del Castello until 1498. Now, Vasari does mention that Raphael's father apprenticed him to the Umbrian master Pietro Perugino, despite his mother's objections. Well, the only evidence for this apprenticeship comes from Vasari, and only one other source, and it has been contested, since starting an apprenticeship at 8 years old, it's a little bit young don't you think? Now, another theory suggests that the young Raphael received some training from Timoteo Viti, who became the court painter in Urbino in 1495. In fact, most modern historians would agree, at least at the time of this video, that Raphael worked as an assistant to Perugino around 1500. The influence of Perugino on Raphael's early work is extremely obvious. It has been noted by one modern observer, the name of Wolflin, that likely no other prodigious pupil has assimilated as extensively his master's instruction as Raphael did. Now, Vasari had claimed that it was impossible to distinguish between their work during this period. That's how much he was taking on the style. So it's not only in terms of theory, it's practice, learning everything from the master. Well, however, many contemporary art historians believe that they can identify Raphael's contributions in specific sections of Perugino's paintings, or those from his workshop. Don't ask me why. I don't know how they could tell that apart. I'm not an art expert, but maybe you are. If you know, tell me in the comments. Now, beyond these stylistic similarities, their techniques are also comparable. For example, they both apply the paint very thickly, really smashing it onto the canvas, and they use an oil varnish medium in shadows for this darker sort of contexts and colors, especially in clothing, and applying it very lightly on the flesh areas. There's also a high resin content in their varnish, which often causes this kind of cracking in paintings, and I'm sure you've seen this before. If you've looked at any paintings within art galleries very close up, you will see these kinds of cracks and imperfections. That's not due to any poor handling, it's just the ravages of time. Well, Perugino's workshop operated in both Perugia and Florence, possibly maintaining two permanent locations. Well, in December 1500, Raphael is already described as a master, indicating that he had indeed completed his training. So, Raphael's first recorded work was the Baronci altarpiece at the Church of St. Nicholas in Tolentino in Città di Castello, which is a town kind of between Perugia and Urbino. Now, there was an Evangelista da Pientimaletto, who had previously worked for Raphael's father, was also commissioned for the panel. It was ordered in 1500 and completed the following year, but only a few fragments and a preparatory drawing survive today, unfortunately, so we're left with a bit of a mystery as to how the completed work would have looked like. In the following years, Raphael produced more works for several churches, including the Mond Crucifixion around 1503, the Brera Wedding of the Virgin, 1504, and the actual altarpiece for Perugia. Now, it is likely as well that he visited Florence during this time. There are substantial works, some executed in fresco, where Raphael skillfully arranges his compositions in the rather static style of Perugino. During this period, he created numerous small and exquisite cabinet paintings, possibly intended for the connoisseurs of the Urbino court, such as the Three Graces of St. Michael, and began producing Madonnas and portraits. In 1502, he travelled to Siena at the invitation of Pinturicchio, another pupil of Perugino who was being a friend of Raphael and recognized him as an exceptional draftsman. He was there to assist him with a few paintings and likely the designs for a series of frescoes in the Piccolomini library within the Siena Cathedral. So a decent job. That's not bad, especially when you can buddy up with a friend and do that sort of stuff. I imagine it would be good fun. Well, clearly he's in high demand, even in this early stage of his career. being called out to neighboring cities, neighboring towns, all that sort of thing. It's not often you get that for a young guy. And so I suppose this kind of led him to leading this nomadic-like existence, working in various locations across northern Italy, wherever somebody would call him to go. But he did spend a pretty significant time in Florence, probably starting around 1504, although there is a traditional designation of a Florentine period from 1504 to 1508. He may not have lived there continuously during those years, though. We're not quite sure of it yet. Now, he might have needed to travel to the city for supplies, however, or other practical reasons, but permanent roots, that's debatable. Well, a letter of recommendation for Raphael, dated October 1504, from the mother of the future Duke of Urbino, states, "The bearer of this letter is Raphael, painter of Urbino, who, possessing exceptional talent in his craft, has resolved to spend some time in Florence for this purpose of study." It continues, "Due to his father's commendable character, and my strong attachment to him, coupled with the son's sensibility and good manners, I hold him in high regard." Well, that's a pretty good reference, isn't it? Well, Raphael, just like Perugino and many others, was combining these Florentine influences alongside developing his own style. Of course, the Renaissance, everybody wanted to develop their own style. That was the point of the Renaissance. To be born again. That's what it means, the rebirth. Now, Fra Bartolomeo, whom Vasari identifies as a good friend of Raphael, may have had an impact on the newly gigantic figures in the Perugia frescoes, which date back to 1505. Of course, Leonardo da Vinci, I'm no doubt you're familiar with, who actually lived in the city again from 1500 to 1506, was the most influential figure during his time. Raphael's figures take on more complex and dynamic positions, while he mostly paints peaceful scenes. But, well, you gotta make money somehow. And he did do quite a few of these sketchy drawings of naked men fighting each other, which was apparently very popular at the time in Florence. I suppose private commissions. Now, in another drawing, there is a young woman depicted with an air reminiscent of Raphael, despite using the same three-quarter length pyramidal composition as the recently completed Mona Lisa. The pyramidal Holy Family, an innovative compositional choice by Leonardo, was represented in a series of works that rank among his most famous easel paintings. This contrapposto, as they call it, position for St. Catherine of Alexandria was borrowed from an illustration by Raphael in the royal collection that shows Leonardo's long-lost Leda and the Swan. Well, to make his flesh depictions more nuanced, he used the understandings of Leonardo's techniques, this sfumato technique they called it, and works on the interaction of gazers among these groups, which are far less cryptic than Leonardo's. The delicate luminosity that is Perugino's signature is still there in his works. Very hard to shake these old habits. Well, Michelangelo, I'm sure you know that name. I've done a video on him too. He was also in Rome at the same time as Raphael. And actually, he developed quite a dislike for him. In fact, he already had a dislike for, or even a pre-existing hatred for Leonardo. But in terms of Raphael, he accused Raphael of directly plotting against him. Sounds like a little bit of jealousy, if you ask me. Perhaps there are certain elements of Raphael's work that could have arguably been derivative of Michelangelo's style, but, well, it's all debatable, isn't it? Now, either way, Raphael spent the rest of his life in Rome after relocating there in 1508. Donato Bramante, the architect constructing St. Peter's Basilica at the time, who was actually a different relative of Raphael and also hailed from the area around Urbino, may have been asked by the new pope, Julius II, to extend an invitation to him. Now, unlike Michelangelo, who stayed in Rome for months after his first summons, Julius immediately commissioned Raphael to fresco the Vatican Palace, which was to serve as the private library of the Pope. He had only ever made one altarpiece in Florence proper before this one, so it was both bigger and more important than really anything he had done before. It was a very big deal, a big contract. Don't mess it up. Well, in different rooms there were plethoras of artists and their teams all hard at work, with many of them reworking pieces that had been commissioned by Alexander VI, Julius's hated predecessor, whose contributions and insignia he was determined to remove from the palace. The Sistine Chapel ceiling was to be painted by Michelangelo, who had already been commissioned to do the task. Well, the famous stanze, or Raphael rooms, now called the Stanza della Segnatura, because it was used by Vasari, had a profound impact on Roman art, and is generally thought of as Raphael's greatest work. And it includes, of course, the School of Athens, which is probably the most well-known, recognizable work of his, the Parnassus, and the Disputa. Later on, Raphael was given more painting space, forcing artists like Perugino and Signorelli out of their studios. Now, Raphael clearly took clues from Michelangelo's Sistine Chapel ceiling while painting the room. According to Vasari, Bramante secretly let him into the chapel to take a little bit of a look at what was going on. By 1511, Raphael had completed the first section of the work, and for the next decades, artists in Italy were preoccupied with how to respond to Michelangelo's enormous influence. Raphael, who had previously shown that he could incorporate influences into his own style, accomplished the task more skillfully than any other artist, with clear influences from the Sistine Chapel, Sibyl's, and Ignudi. Michelangelo's self-portrait as Heraclitus in the School of Athens certainly stands out. But while Raphael's signature style developed, other figures in that and the following paintings in the chamber show the same or comparable influences. Years after Raphael's death, Michelangelo bemoaned in a letter that everything he knew about art he acquired from me. But other remarks show more charitable feelings. Either way, Michelangelo seems to have been directly accusing Raphael of copying everything he did. Direct plagiarism. Well, there is a point where it crosses a certain line. But it's not like he was just photocopying the Sistine Chapel ceiling. He was still a good painter. I suppose it opens up a conversation of, can somebody own a style of art? That is an interesting conversation to have, isn't it? And where do we draw a line between influence and direct plagiarism? It's hard to tell. If there is a line, it's a bit of a blurry one. Well, either way, from the very beginning, these huge, complex compositions have been held in high esteem as the great style of the High Renaissance and classic art of the Western world. at least after the 16th century. Well, carefully planned compositions exude this word sprezzatura, a word in which his friend Castiglione invented to describe a certain nonchalance that conceals all artistry and renders whatever one articulates or performed as uncontrived or effortless. Think of this Chinese concept of wu wei, doing without trying. Well, after Bramante died in 1514, the rebuilt St. Peter's Basilica was given to Raphael as its architect. Some of his drawings have survived, which is quite fortunate, but most of the work has either been altered or destroyed after he died, because immediately afterwards Michelangelo's design was adopted. Now, Antonio da Sangallo the Younger characterized the final design, which included substantial piers along the nave, as like an alley in a negative posthumous evaluation. His proposals would have made the church cathedral a lot more solemn. Now, there was a good chance that it looked like the temple in the expulsion of Heliodorus from the temple. Perhaps so, but the finished product is quite a bit different. Now, he designed a plethora of additional buildings, and for a short time held the title of Rome's foremost architect, catering to a very exclusive group of people connected directly to the upper circles of the papacy. The city of Rome was reorganized by Julius, you see, the Pope, who added many new streets and wanted them adorned with these magnificent buildings, somewhat of a throwback to its former glory. But always there is this romanticized view of Rome in antiquity that's probably not quite conducive to reality, but glory days always spark the imagination. Well, despite its complete destruction to make way for Bernini's Piazza for St. Peter's, drawings of the courtyard and facade of the Palazzo Branconio dell'Aquila, a notable building for Leo's papal chamberlain Giovanni Battista Branconio, persist. The three-story front was unusually elaborate for its time, with elaborate sculpture on the ground floor and painted panels covering the top two stories. Now, although Raphael did not come up with the main ideas for the Villa Farnesina, he did collaborate with the papal treasurer Agostino Chigi on the design and decoration of the Chigi Chapel, which features quite a few mosaics. While originally built for the physician of Pope Leo, the Palazzo Jacopo de Brescia was moved in the 1930s, but even though it was moved, it is still standing today. It was designed to complement a neighboring Bramante house, where Raphael actually lived for a while on a permanent basis. Well, Bramante asked Raphael to assess modern copies of Lacan and his sons around 1510. He was appointed prefect in 1515 and given control over all artifacts found in or within 1 mile of the city. Anyone finding artifacts had to tell Raphael within 3 days, and masons could not remove inscriptions without permission. In a letter he sent to Pope Leo, Raphael suggested ways to save historical sites from destruction and called for an exhaustive visual inventory of the city's artifacts. During the construction of St. Peter's, the Pope sought to reuse ancient masonry, while simultaneously documenting all ancient inscriptions and preserving sculptures that had been previously used. Now, according to the notebook of Marino Sanuto the Younger, in 1519, Raphael had actually suggested moving an obelisk from the mausoleum of Augustus to St. Peter's Square, but of course he would need 90,000 ducats to do it. According to Marcantonio Michel, intellectuals were discouraged by Raphael's untimely death Oh, sorry, spoiler alert, he dies at the end, because the artist was unable to finish painting the breathtakingly beautiful scene of ancient Rome. Unfortunately, it seems that Raphael's ambition to make an archaeological map of classical Rome never really came to fruition. What a shame. Well, at least we do have 4 archaeological drawings that have been preserved, but, well, they're not as good as what we could have had. You can't always get what you want, can't you? Well, of course, Raphael spent most of his time working on projects directly for the Vatican, but he also painted many portraits, including those of his principal patrons, that is, Pope Julius II and Leo X, the former of which is considered a masterpiece, and yeah, it's pretty good. A few more portraits showed him with people he knew, like Castiglione or people in the close circle of the Pope. Pope Pius IX sent 2 artworks to King Francis I of France as a diplomatic gift, and many other kings from many other lands spoke quite highly of Raphael's works. Now, an opulent banker and papal treasurer named Agostino Chigi had the Triumph of Galatia and other ornamental frescoes painted for his Villa Farnesina, mosaics made for the burial chapel at Santa Maria de Popolo, and a chapel in the church of Santa Maria della Paz. With his workshop handling the work in both residences, Raphael also designed some decorations for Villa Madama. Now, we also address the Raphael cartoons, which is a set of 10 drawings which are now housed in the Victoria and Albert Museum, represent scenes from the lives of Saints Paul and Peter, who created for tapestries of the Sistine Chapel, and they were some of his most important papal commissions. Several of these drawings still exist. They were sent to Pierre van Eelst's workshop in Brussels to be wove. Since the series was probably finished in 1520, Raphael may have seen it before he died. In addition, he built and painted the Loggie at the Vatican, a small gallery with Roman-style architecture that opens to a courtyard on one side. It's really pretty. Among his many illustrious altarpieces are the Sistine Madonna and the Ecstasy of St. Cecilia. His last work, a monumental Transfiguration, was finished shortly before he passed away. It, along with Il Spasimo, is kind of this testament, like a crescendo of his career. It shows how his art has evolved in later years when he leaned more towards proto-Baroque than these old Mannerist styles. Ain't nothing wrong with the old styles, just saying. Now, many of his works, like the Madonna of the Pinks, are on wooden supports. However, he was also rather known for using canvas, as seen in the Sistine Madonna, and drying oils such as walnut and linseed to create his works, incorporating practically all modern pigments into his lavish palette were ochres, vermilion, lead tin yellow, madder lake and verdigris, along with many more. But he also used this rare Brazil wood lake, this metallic powdered gold, and the less well-known metallic powdered bismuth in a number of compositions, including the Anside Madonna. According to Vasari, Raphael eventually set up a workshop with 50 students, some of whom actually went on to become famous painters themselves. I mean, they better. If you had a teacher like Raphael, you better become a famous painter. Imagine you send your kid to a school and that is the teacher. You pay out all the money and by the end of it he shrugs his shoulders and says, "No, I'm going to go play the violin instead." Good Lord. Well, of course, this workshop was well above the norm. I'm sure we can all agree with that. Now, they included apprentices, journeymen, and famous masters from all over Italy, who were probably working as kind of like subcontractors for their own teams. Of course, they were all working on their own commissions under the guidance of the masters. And of course, because of that, the artworks themselves are often difficult to assign to a particular artist. And we have very little information about the workshop's internal working structures beyond that. Now, Gianfrancesco Penni, a seasoned master from Florence, and Giulio Romano, a young follower from Rome, who was about 21 at the time of Raphael's death, were the main characters in this workshop. Now, after Raphael passed away, they continued the workshop to some extent and inherited many of his drawings and other possessions. After Raphael died, Penni became Giulio's subordinate partner for a large chunk of his later career, and as a result, Penni never really achieved a personal fame equal to Giulio's. Both the renowned master, Perino del Vaga, and supposedly elevated worker, Polidoro de Caravaggio, became famous painters in their own right. De Vaga had previously been employed as a construction site laborer. Similar to Penni, Polidoro's associate, Maturino di Firenze, has subsequently been more famous than him. Giovanni da Udine was a more independent and responsible for the grotesques and ornamental stucco that encircled the main frescoes. Well, after that, many of the artists were scattered. Some died in 1527 during that terrible sack of Rome. God knows how much of the artwork was destroyed in that too. Of course, this made them all scatter around in panic and go to different parts of Europe, which helped Raphael's style spread across Italy and beyond in all different forms. So I suppose there's a silver lining to that cloud. Of course, Raphael was one of the most exceptional draftsmen in Western art history, and he utilized these extensive drawings to devise his compositions. A near contemporary noted that while initiating a composition, he would spread numerous stock drawings on the floor and commence drawing rapidly, almost madly, appropriating figures from various sources. More than 40 of his sketches remain for the disputa in the stanza. It is likely that more have existed initially. A total of almost 400 pages are preserved. He employed various sketches to enhance his poses and compositions, seemingly more extensively than most other artists, as evidenced by the multitude of surviving variants. Of course, most Raphael drawings exhibit this considerable precision. Even preliminary sketches, including bare outlines of figures, are meticulously rendered, while subsequent working drawings frequently possess a significant level of refinement, incorporating shading and occasionally highlights in white. Although they lack the freedom and vitality shown in certain sketches by Michelangelo and Leonardo, they are consistently artistically pleasing. Well, at least to me they are. Well, he was among the final artists to extensively employ the metal point, sharp-tipped piece of silver or another metal, although he also excelled in the more versatile medium of red or black chalk. In his latter years, he was among the initial artists to employ female models for preparatory sketches, but male students, or garzoni, were typically utilized for studies of both genders. Now, Raphael did not create prints independently, but collaborated with Marcantonio Raimondi to produce engravings based on Raphael's drawings, resulting in numerous renowned Italian prints of the century and significantly contributing to the emergence of reproductive printmaking. His passion was atypical for a prominent artist among his contemporaries. It was only shared by Titian, maybe Titian, who had collaborated with Raimondi, with somewhat less success. Approximately 50 of these prints were produced. Some were reproductions of Raphael's paintings, while others were designs seemingly conceived by Raphael just for the printmaking. Raphael created preparatory drawings, many of which still exist for Raimondi to convert into engravings. Really good stuff for the early days of printing. Well, the most renowned original prints produced from the cooperation were Lucretia, the Judgment of Paris, and the Massacre of the Innocents, of which two nearly identical versions were engraved. The prints of the paintings, the Parnassus and the Galatea, were particularly renowned. Now, outside of Italy, reproducing engravings by Raimondi and others were the primary means through which Raphael's art was encountered until at least the 20th century. Baviero Carocci, referred to as Il Baviera by Vasari, was an aide whom Raphael obviously entrusted with his finances, and following Raphael's demise, Carocci gained custody of the majority of the copper plates and subsequently enjoyed a prosperous career by reprinting them and being the publisher. Well, from 1517 until his passing, Raphael resided at the Palazzo Caprini, situated at the intersection of Piazza Scorsa Cavalli and Via Alessandrina in the Borgo, in considerable opulence, of course, within a palace erected by Bramante. What, did you think he was going to be like all the other painters and poets, dying in some filthy gutter somewhere? No, he actually had a decent retirement. I know, I'm as surprised as you are. Well, it appears that, I don't get too ahead of myself. He remained unmarried, but got engaged to Maria Bibbiena in 1514. That was the niece of the Cardinal Bibbiena. Now it appears that his friend, the Cardinal, had somewhat talked him into this engagement, and he had quite a lack of enthusiasm, evidenced by the fact that the marriage did not occur before her death in 1520. So a pretty long engagement of 6 years. Yeah, pushing it forward that much. I'm sure he wasn't too excited to get married. Well, he is reputed to have engaged, of course, in numerous affairs, but a constant presence in his life in Rome was La Fornarina, Margherita Lutti, the daughter of a baker from Siena who resided at Via del Governo Vecchio. He was appointed groom of the chamber for the Pope around this time, conferring him courtly rank and, of course, a little bit of supplementary money, as well as being a designated knight of the Papal Order of the Golden Spur. Vasari also adds that he contemplated the aspiration of becoming a cardinal himself, possibly influenced by Leo, which might also explain that postponement of his marriage. Could be. Either way, Good Friday, April 6, 1520, the final day of the life of Raphael, and only his 37th birthday. Vasari states that Raphael was born on Good Friday, which in 1483 occurred on March 28th, and that the artist succumbed to weariness due to relentless romantic pursuits while engaged in the Loggia project. Subsequent historians and scientists have provided different explanations for his death, including a combination of infectious sickness and bloodletting. If you don't know what that is, there was an old belief that basically, if you were sick, you had the bad blood in your body, so you had to get the bad blood out. And there's only one way that happens. They got to cut you up. Yeah. Looking back on it all, it's I'm glad we've made advances in that. Well, During his severe illness, which persisted for 15 days, Raphael remained collected enough to confess his sins, receive the last rites, and arrange all of his affairs. He bequeathed adequate resources for his mistress's maintenance, assigned to his faithful servant Baviera, and allocated the majority of his studio possessions to Guido Romano and Penny. Now, at his best, Raphael was interred in the Pantheon, and he had a very opulent funeral. Of course, everybody showed up for that. There was a journal by Paris de Grasse that states that 4 cardinals, attired in purple, transported his body to the final resting place, the hand of which was kissed by the Pope himself. Now, if that doesn't get you into heaven, I don't know what will. There is an inscription on the marble sarcophagus of Raphael that says, "Here lies the illustrious Raphael, whom nature feared to be vanquished during his lifetime, and when he was dying, feared for her own demise." Michelangelo Buonarroti, born in 1475 in Caprese, Italy, stands among the titans of the Italian Renaissance, renowned for his profound influence across multiple artistic disciplines, including sculpture, painting, architecture, and poetry. His iconic works, such as the sculptures David and Pietà, display an unparalleled mastery of human form and emotion, embodying the Renaissance ideal of humanistic expression. And perhaps his most famous achievement, the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel, painted between 1508 and 1512, continues to draw admiration worldwide to this very day. Thus his life's work, marked by a relentless pursuit of artistic perfection, not only elevated him as a quintessential Renaissance man, but also as a symbol of the era's spirit, blending technical skill with a profound exploration of what it means to be human. Hello there and welcome to the channel. If it's your first time here, it's good to meet you. And if you're coming back, great to have you back with me again. As always, for those who want to support the channel, a like and subscribe certainly helps. And if you want to go above and beyond, there are a few links in the video description. Now, without further ado, I will invite you to get nice and relaxed as we go on another exploration into that fascinating past. Michelangelo was born on the 6th of March, 1475, in the small town of Caprese, now known as Caprese Michelangelo, located in Valtiberina near Arezzo, Tuscany. His family, originally small-scale bankers in Florence, had at this time fallen on, well, let's just say, hard times, leading his father, Ludovico de Leonardo Buonarroti Simone, to accept government post in Caprese. At that time, Ludovico was serving as the town's judicial administrator and podesta of Chiusi della Verna. Michelangelo's mother was Francesca di Neri del Miniato di Siena. The family claimed descent from the Countess Matilde di Canossa, a lineage Michelangelo believed in, though it's yet to be verified. Shortly after his birth, Michelangelo's family returned to Florence. His early years were marked by his mother's illness and death in 1481, when he was merely 6 years old. Consequently, he was raised partly by a nanny and her husband, who was a stone cutter, in Settigano, where his father actually owned a marble quarry and a small farm. Of course, being around all that marble certainly influences a young lad, and this environment sparked his lifelong affinity for marble. His education began in Florence under the humanist Francesco da Urbino, but he was somewhat disinterested in formal studies, drawn to art instead, no pun intended. He spent his time copying church paintings and mingling with local artists, and there were plenty of them. Florence, a vibrant center of the arts and learning during the Renaissance, provided a fertile ground for his early artistic development. Influential figures such as Filippo Brunelleschi and Lorenzo Ghiberti were pivotal in shaping the artistic landscape of the city. At the age of 13, he apprenticed with Domenico Ghirlandaio, a prominent painter of frescoes and portraits, and his talent was very evident from early on. By the age of 14, he was already earning an artist's wage, which is of course extremely uncommon, even back in those days for somebody so young. Especially in Florence, too, where you had plenty of artists around. Even at such a young age of 14, he was already sticking out among them. Now in 1489, Michelangelo was recommended by Ghirlandaio to Lorenzo de' Medici, leading to his study at the influential Platonic Academy, which was founded by the Medici family. Here he was exposed to the foremost thinkers of the day, like Marsilio Ficini and Pico della Mirandola. During this period, Michelangelo created two significant reliefs, the Madonna of the Stairs and the Battle of the Centaurs, the latter inspired by a suggestion from the scholar Poliziano and commissioned by Lorenzo de' Medici. His time at the Academy was also marred by an incident with a fellow student, one Pietro Torrigiano, who struck him, causing a noticeable disfigurement to his nose. It seems that Michelangelo could not paint his way out of that one. Well, his early years were thus a blend of rigorous training, profound artistic development, occasional fistfights, and personal hardships, all set against the backdrop of Renaissance Florence intellectual and artistic ferment. What a time to be alive! Now the death of Lorenzo de' Medici on April 8, 1492, marked a turning point for Michelangelo, who left the Medici court and returned to his father's house. During this period, he carved a polychrome wooden crucifix in 1493 as a gesture of gratitude to the prior of Santo Spirito in Florence, who had permitted Michelangelo to study anatomy through the dissection of corpses from the church's hospital. This study of cadavers was the first of many that would profoundly influence his understanding of the human form. Michelangelo soon purchased a large block of marble and sculptured a Herculean statue that was eventually sent to France and later lost in the 18th century. In January of 1494, amidst heavy snowfall, Piero de' Medici, Lorenzo's heir, commissioned Michelangelo to create a temporary snow statue, marking his brief return to the Medici fold. However, later that year, the Medici were ousted from Florence due to the rise of the Savonarola, prompting Michelangelo to leave Florence for Venice, then Bologna. In Bologna, he was commissioned to complete several small figures for the shrine of St. Dominic. During his stay, he studied the reliefs of Jacopo della Quercia at the Basilica of St. Petronius, which influenced his later work on the Sistine Chapel ceiling. He then returned to Florence in late 1495, when things had stabilized a little after Charles VIII's defeats in Italy, but he found no work under the new government led by Savonarola. Back in Florence, Michelangelo sculpted two statues, a child St. John the Baptist and a sleeping Cupid. Following an intriguing suggestion by Lorenzo di Pierfrancesco de' Medici, Michelangelo aged the statue of Cupid to make it appear ancient, allowing it to be sold under the guise of an antiquity in Rome. That's one way of making money. But unfortunately, the ruse was eventually uncovered by Cardinal Raphael, the buyer. But he was so impressed by the work anyway that he invited Michelangelo to Rome. Thus he arrived in Rome on the 25th of June 1496, and soon began work on a statue of Bacchus for Cardinal Riario. Although the cardinal ultimately rejected the finished piece, it was purchased by banker Jacopo Galli for his garden. Michelangelo's Roman career took a decisive turn in November of 1497, when he received a commission from the French cardinal Jean de Belliers-Lagrola to sculpt the Pietà. This sculpture, which depicts the Virgin Mary giving over the body of Jesus, was completed when Michelangelo was 24 and exemplifies his capacity to portray human emotion and form. The Pietà achieved critical acclaim, epitomized by Giorgio Vasari's praise for its unprecedented perfection. This masterpiece, now housed in St. Peter's Basilica, solidified Michelangelo's reputation, illustrating his mastery in capturing both physical detail and emotional depth, carving it straight into the marble. Some years later, in 1499, Michelangelo returned to a now transformed Florence, shaken by the fall of the anti-Renaissance priest Girolamo Savonarola, who was actually executed in 1498, and of course the rise of a new Piero Soderini. Michelangelo was soon commissioned by the Guild of Wool to complete an unfinished project initiated 40 years earlier by Agostino di Duccio, a colossal statue of David, which was meant to symbolize Florentine freedom. Michelangelo's completion of the David in 1504 marked a pinnacle in his career, showcasing his unrivaled skill and imaginative power. The masterpiece was originally intended for the Florence Cathedral, but was instead placed in the Piazza della Signoria, in front of the Palazzo Vecchio, with a replica now standing in its original spot, while the original is housed in the Accademia. Around the same time, Michelangelo might have contributed to the sculptural work on the facade of the Palazzo Vecchio, known as the Importuno di Michelangelo, an attribution supported by similarities between the facade's profile and a drawing by Michelangelo which is now in the Louvre. With the placement of David, another significant commission came to Michelangelo. In 1504, he was commissioned to paint the Battle of Cascina on the council chamber walls of the Palazzo Vecchio, opposite Leonardo da Vinci's work, The Battle of Anghiari. Michelangelo's fresco, depicting soldiers ambushed while bathing, contrasted with Leonardo's portrayal of a cavalry battle. Neither masterpiece was completed, and both were eventually lost when the chamber was renovated, though they remained influential and were copied by artists such as Rubens and Bastiano da Sangallo. During this period, Michelangelo also painted the Donitondo, a vibrant depiction of the Holy Family commissioned by Angelo Doni for his wife Maddalena Strozzi. This work, which still hangs in the Uffizi Gallery, is famed for its unique frame, possibly designed by Michelangelo himself. Additionally, he likely painted the Manchester Madonna, which is now housed in the National Gallery of London. In 1505, he was summoned to Rome by Pope Julius II and commissioned to create the Pope's elaborate tomb, a project fraught with interruptions that continued sporadically over 40 years, but was never completed to Michelangelo's ultimate satisfaction. During this time, Michelangelo's relationship with Julius II was tumultuous to say the least, marked by frequent disputes and a temporary departure from Rome in 1506. Although he worked on the tomb until 1545, it remained unfinished. Today, the tomb is located in the church of San Pietro in Vincoli in Rome, and includes the renowned statue of Moses and the sculptures Rebellious Slave and Dying Slave, which are now in the Louvre. Now, his painting of the Sistine Chapel, completed between 1508 and 1512, is of course arguably his most renowned work, executed over approximately 4 years. That's one hell of a project. The commission was originally involved a simpler concept proposed by others, who, according to Condivi's biography, hoped that Michelangelo would fail, as painting was not his primary medium. The initial plan was for Michelangelo to paint the 12 apostles on the chapel's triangular pendatives, and to adorn the central ceiling with decorative motifs. However, Michelangelo successfully persuaded Pope Julius II to allow him greater creative freedom, which of course led to a more and more ambitious design. The resulting masterpiece now extends across about 500 square meters and features over 300 figures, encapsulating a complex narrative of biblical and theological themes. The artwork is structured around 9 central panels, grouped into 3 thematic sequences, starting with the creation of the earth, the creation and fall of humankind, and the stories of Noah and his descendants, illustrating the human condition post-fall of man. Supporting the ceiling structure are pendatives adorned with figures of 12 prophetic personalities, comprising 7 Hebrew prophets and 5 sibyls from classical antiquity, who foretold the coming of Christ. These comprehensive iconography serves not only as a visual recounting of foundational Christian stories, but also as an embodiment of the Catholic Church's teachings. Among the ceiling's numerous iconic images are the creation of Adam, where God breathes life into Adam. This section is particularly celebrated. Other notable frescoes include scenes of Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, the Great Flood, the sombre visage of the prophet Jeremiah, and the enigmatic Cumaean Sibyl. Michelangelo's work on the Sistine Chapel not only reaffirmed his artistic genius, but also enrich the cultural and spiritual heritage of the Vatican. It was also a massive slap in the face to all the haters who said he couldn't do it. So, there's that too. Well, in 1513, following the death of Pope Julius II, Michelangelo found himself under the patronage of Pope Leo X, Lorenzo de' Medici's second son. Leo encouraged Michelangelo to resume work on Julius II's tomb. However, in 1516 their relationship soured when Louis X attempted to annex the Duchy of Urbino from Julius's nephew, leading to renewed enmity between the families. Subsequently, Leo diverted Michelangelo's efforts from the tomb to a new project, that being the facade of the Basilica of San Lorenzo in Florence. Thus, Michelangelo dedicated 3 years to designing the facade, and even attempted to establish a new marble quarry for it at Pietrasanta. But despite his efforts, the project was terminated in 1520 due to financial constraints from his patrons, and the basilica remains without a facade to this very day. In the same year, the Medici family approached Michelangelo with a proposal. They wanted him to design the Medici Chapel within the same basilica. This project was to honor the family, including tombs for the younger Medici, Giuliano, Duke of Nemours, and his nephew Lorenzo. Michelangelo had creative freedom on this project, which was realized more fully than the earlier facade project. He created a series of sculptures for the chapel, including the famous allegorical figures of night and day, dawn and dusk, as well as the Medici Madonna. In fact, in 1976, a hidden corridor filled with Michelangelo's sketches for the chapel was discovered, all the rough drafts and little bits and pieces he was trying to work out. How fascinating. Well, Pope Leo X died in 1521, and after his death and the brief papacy of Adrian VI, Giulio de' Medici became Pope Clement VII. Michelangelo was then commissioned to design the Laurentian Library at San Lorenzo, which he did with a pioneering architectural style that prefigured the Baroque movement. However, Michelangelo would not see this project completed in his lifetime, as it was not finished until long after his death. But once again, back in Florence, politics were becoming turbulent, and in 1527, after the sack of Rome, Florentines expelled the Medici and restored the Republic. Michelangelo supported this cause, contributing to the city's defenses. However, the Medici regained power 3 years later in 1530, and Michelangelo was sentenced to death by Pope Clement VII, also a Medici. He supposedly hid during this time in a small secret room under the Medici chapels, where he made numerous drawings. Of course, discovered in 1975, this room was later opened to public viewings in 2023. Ultimately, Michelangelo was pardoned, likely due to his invaluable artistic talent, allowing him to return to his significant commissions in Rome, including the completion of the Medici Chapel and his continued work on the Sistine Chapel. This reconciliation allowed Michelangelo to leave Florence for Rome in 1534, where he spent the remainder of his life, despite previous allegiances to the Florentine Republic. Thus Michelangelo settled near the church of Santa Maria di Loreto in Rome, where he formed a significant friendship with the poet Vittoria Colonna, Marchioness of Pescara. Their friendship lasted until her death in 1547, deeply influencing Michelangelo's life and work. Now in 1534, shortly after Pope Clement VII died, he commissioned Michelangelo to paint the Last Judgment on the altar wall of the Sistine Chapel, a monumental task that commenced under Pope Paul III's patronage. Michelangelo worked on this massive fresco from 1534 until 1541. The work depicts the second coming of Christ and the divine judgment of souls, where Christ is represented as a powerful, muscular figure, youthful and devoid of a beard, completely surrounded by saints. Notably, St. Bartholomew is depicted holding his own flayed skin, which features a self-portrait of Michelangelo. Little Easter egg there for you. Now the portrayal, particularly the nudity of Christ and the Virgin Mary, sparked a bit of controversy in its day and was deemed sacrilegious by some within the church. Although there was a push led by Cardinal Carafa and Monsignor Cernini, the ambassador from Mantua, to have the frescoes censored or removed, the Pope simply rejected these pressures because he liked it. But eventually, after Michelangelo's death and during the Council of Trent, a decision was made to cover the nudity depicted in the frescape. Daniel de Volterra, a student of Michelangelo, was tasked with this modification, earning him the nickname Il Bragatone, the breeches maker. A faithful and uncensored copy by Marcello Venusti exists and is housed in the Capodimonte Museum in Naples. Now, besides his painting, Michelangelo engaged in several architectural projects during this period. He was tasked with designing part of the Capitoline Hill, which included a trapezoidal piazza designed to frame the equestrian statue of Marcus Aurelius. And what a statue that is! It's gorgeous. He also worked on the upper floor of the Palazzo Farnese and reimagined the interior of the Church of Santa Maria degli Angeli, ingeniously incorporating the structure of an ancient Roman bathhouse. His architectural contributions extended to San Giovanni de Fiorentini, the Sforza Chapel in Santa Maria Maggiore, and the design of Porta Pia, one of the gates in the walls of Rome. While Michelangelo was completing the Last Judgment, he was commissioned to undertake another significant project at the Vatican, the painting of two large frescoes in the Cappella Paolina. These frescoes, finished in 1550, depict pivotal moments in the lives of key saints of Rome, the conversion of St. Paul and the crucifixion of St. Peter. Both pieces, like the Last Judgment, feature complex compositions with numerous figures, demonstrating Michelangelo's mastery in handling dynamic and crowded scenes. The more you look, the more you see. The same year he finished these frescoes, Giorgio Vasari published his Vita, which included a biography of Michelangelo, celebrating his achievements and contributions to the art world. In 1546, Michelangelo took on significant architectural roles as the architect of St. Peter's Basilica in Rome. The project had been ongoing for 50 years, with little progress since the initial foundations were laid in 1506, following Bramante's plans. Thus Michelangelo revitalized the project, drawing inspiration from Bramante's original designs for a centrally planned church. He made substantial enhancements to the structure's physical and visual strength. Although the iconic dome of St. Peter's was only completed posthumously, it is regarded by architectural historians as one of the greatest creations of the Renaissance. As the construction of St. Peter's progressed, concerns grew that Michelangelo may not live to see the completion of the dome. Nevertheless, once the lower part of the dome and its supporting structures began construction, the completion of Michelangelo's designs became an inevitability. On the 7th of December 2007, a red chalk sketch believed to be one of Michelangelo's final designs for the dome was discovered in the Vatican archives. This rare sketch, thought to be a partial plan for one of the radial columns of the cupola drum, is particularly valuable, as Michelangelo was known to have destroyed many of his sketches later in his life. He was also deeply committed to his Catholic faith, particularly as he aged, and at this time he was well and truly aging, and he was also a member of the secular Franciscan order. His spirituality, of course, profoundly influenced his art and writings, and that includes his poetry. One of his poems from the 1554 poignantly reflects this deepening faith with the lines, "Neither painting nor sculpture will be able any longer to calm my soul, now turn toward that divine dealing with love that opened his arms on the cross to take us in." And in his personal life, Michelangelo was known for his asceticism. Despite his considerable wealth, i.e. his net worth was worth around 50,000 gold ducats, he lived quite frugally, claiming to his apprentice Ascanio Condivi, "However rich I may have been, I have always lived like a poor man." His approach to food and sleep was similarly Spartan. He ate sparingly, out of necessity rather than pleasure, and he often slept fully clothed, including his boots. His biographer, Paolo Giovio, depicted him as a rugged and solitary man, stating that his lack of concern for comfort possibly deterred potential students. Now, Michelangelo's sexuality, much discussed by scholars, is most prominently reflected in his extensive body of poetry, which includes over 300 sonnets and madrigals, with about 60 of them directed at men. This body of work represents a significant early collection of poetry expressing affection from one man to another. His relationship with the young nobleman Tommaso de Cavalieri, whom he met when Cavalieri was 23 and he was 57, is particularly noted for its depth of feeling. His affection for Cavalieri inspired him to produce several exquisite drawings and poems. Giorgio Vasari noted Michelangelo's special affection towards Cavalieri, for whom he created drawings described as divinely beautiful. Despite some scholars suggesting that the relationship was purely platonic, the poems to Cavalieri suggest a profound affection, and are considered among the first major expressions of male-male romantic love in modern literature. Michelangelo's poem eloquently expresses this sentiment. "I feel as lit by fire a cold continent, that burns me from afar and keeps itself ice chill, a strength I feel two shapely arms to fill, which without motion moves every balance." Cavalieri reciprocated Michelangelo's deep affection, reportedly vowing, "I swear to return your love. Never have I loved a man more than I have loved you. Never have I wished for a friendship more than I wish for yours." He remained devoted to Michelangelo throughout the artist's life, exemplifying a significant emotional bonds that Michelangelo formed despite his generally solitary demeanor. In 1542, Michelangelo formed a significant relationship with Cecchino de Bracci, who tragically passed away a year later, deeply affecting Michelangelo and inspiring him to write 48 funeral epigrams. Michelangelo's interactions with others often left him vulnerable. For example, the model Febo di Poggio demanded money in exchange for a response to a love poem, and another model, Gerardo Perini, also exploited Michelangelo's generosity. While the content and nature of Michelangelo's poetry have stirred controversy over the centuries, in 1623, his grandnephew, Michelangelo Buonarroti the Younger, altered the original genders in the pronouns of the poems which he published them, while advocating for an allegorical and philosophical interpretation rather than a literal one, a perspective that is still maintained by some modern scholars. However, it wasn't until John Addington Symonds translated the poems into English in 1893 that their original intent was restored, recognizing them as expressions of personal affections towards young men, challenging societal norms of the time. Toward the end of his life, he developed a close and spiritually enriching friendship with one Vittoria Colonna, a poet and noble widow whom he met in Rome between 1536 and 1538. Their relationship was characterized by a deep mutual respect and emotional connection, which was reflected in the sonnets they had exchanged that primarily discussed spiritual and existential themes. Despite his strong connections to men, Michelangelo's regret, as noted by his biographer Condivi, was not seizing the chance to express his affection more openly to Colonna, lamenting that he only kissed her hand and not her face. Michelangelo's early marble work, the Madonna of the Stairs, shows his budding mastery in shallow relief, a technique that was also favored by the early Renaissance sculptor Donatello. The Madonna is depicted in profile, a typical pose for shallow reliefs, while the Christ child is portrayed with a twisting motion, a dynamic element that Michelangelo would continue to explore throughout his career. This work already hints at the innovation that Michelangelo brought to the portrayal of human figures, an approach that would become more pronounced in his later works. And one of these later works, the Taddei Tondo, created in 1502, captures the child Christ in a moment of animated motion, startled by a bullfinch, symbolizing the crucifixion. This lively depiction of the child influenced Raphael's Bridgewater Madonna. Michelangelo's Madonna of Bruges broke away from traditional representations of the Virgin and Child. Instead of presenting her Son, Mary is seen restraining Christ as he steps forward, symbolizing his impending journey into the world. Another significant work, the Donitondo, features a complex interplay of figures and forms within a circular frame, echoing the dynamism found in the Taddei Tono. This painting also serves as a precursor to the vibrant colors and energetic forms Michelangelo would later use in the Sistine Chapel's ceiling. He also created a series of sculptural works for the Arca di San Domenico in Bologna. Among these is a robust, muscular, kneeling angel with classical drapery, contrasting sharply with Niccolò dell'Arca's more delicate angel in Gothic robes. Michelangelo's Bacchus sculpture, commissioned for a specific portrayal of the youthful god of wine, is depicted realistically with attributes such as a vine wreath and a cup of wine, yet with an added touch of inebriation in the god's stance and expression. In the Louvre, his sculptures, The Dying Slave and Rebellious Slave, initially intended for Pope Julius II's tomb, depict figures caught in a struggle, representing awakening and resistance respectively. These works, along with the latter Atlas Slave, part of the series known as The Captives, exemplify Michelangelo's ability to convey this intense emotion and physical states through the medium of marble, showing figures seemingly trying to free themselves from the very stone in which they were carved from. Now the Sistine Chapel ceiling, painted by Michelangelo between 1508 and 1512, is one of the most renowned artworks of the High Renaissance, and indeed one of the most famous artworks of all time. The ceiling's architecture, a flattened barrel vault supported by 12 triangular pendentives between the chapel's windows, was originally intended to feature the 12 apostles. However, Michelangelo, who was initially reluctant to accept the project, convinced the Pope to give him complete creative freedom. And thus the Pope, after some negotiations and some flattering conversation, I'm sure, had pretty much said to Michelangelo, "Fine, do whatever you want with it, as long as it looks good." It's kind of like when you don't know what haircut to get. If you trust the barber, you let him have free rein. Of course, this decision led to a more ambitious design that has left a lasting impact on art history. Of course, doing the 12 apostles would have been great, but everybody does the 12 apostles, don't they? Now the final layout consists of 9 central panels framed by architectural elements, each depicting a scene from the book of Genesis. Michelangelo began the project with the narrative's latter events, starting with the drunkenness of Noah, and initially included detailed backgrounds and multiple figures within these scenes. As he progressed, particularly after the initial scaffolding was removed, Michelangelo increased the scale of the figures, enhancing their dramatic presence. One of the most iconic images from the ceiling is the creation of Adam, celebrated for its profound expressiveness and dynamism. It has indeed become one of the most replicated images in the history of art. The last panel he painted, the separation of light from darkness, is stylistically broader and was completed in just a day. Intriguingly, Michelangelo inserted his own likeness into the depiction of the creator, symbolizing his personal investment and perhaps his view of the artist's divine-like role in creation. And he also created the entire artwork, so, well, I think it's fair enough. Now the pendentives, initially designated for the apostles, instead feature figures of prophets and sibyls who prophesy the coming of the Messiah. The alteration integrates Old Testament themes within the chapel's New Testament decoration, reinforcing the theological continuity between the two testaments. Surrounding the central panels are 20 figures known as the ignudi, whose precise symbolic meanings remain subjects of interpretation, They are variously described as angels, muses, or simply decorative elements. Michelangelo himself referred to these figures in that same word, ignudi. Throughout the process, he dedicated significant effort to the anatomical correctness of his figures, as seen in surviving studies like that of the Libyan Sibyl. These drawings highlight his meticulous approach to hands and feet, ensuring that each detail contributed to the overall impact of the work. The profound thought that he gave to each figure is also reflected in his portrayal of the prophet Jeremiah, which he crafted as a self-portrait. Jeremiah's contemplative pose, mourning the destruction of Jerusalem, mirrors Michelangelo's own introspective nature, and perhaps his personal reflections on his creative and spiritual struggles during the arduous process of painting the chapel ceiling. His Battle of the Centaurs, a relief crafted during his youth under the influence of the Medici Academy, showcases an energetic melee that diverges from the Florentine norm of depicting chaotic scenes solely in contexts, like the Massacre of the Innocents or Hellish Torments. The bold projection of figures might reflect Michelangelo's exposure to Roman sarcophagus reliefs, as well as dynamic figures seen in works by Nicola and Giovanni Pisano, and on Ghiberti's baptistry doors. His architectural contributions include several uncompleted projects, like the facade of Brunelleschi's Church of San Lorenzo in Florence, which remains in rough bricks, as Michelangelo's ambitious designs, including a wooden model, were simply never realized. However, his design for the Medici Chapel and the innovative Laurentian Library vestibule, featuring dramatically recessed columns and a flowing staircase, showcase his mastery of architectural form and his influence on the Mannerist style. In his later years, Michelangelo took on significant architectural projects, like the redesign of Campidoglio's pavement, the addition to the Farnese Palace, and ultimately the completion of St. Peter's Basilica. He also turned his artistic focus towards reflecting on mortality, a theme that was evident in his series of Pietà sculptures. Among these, the Victory is notable, potentially intended for Pope Julius II's tomb, but remaining unfinished. This work features a youthful figure triumphing over an older, hooded man, with the defeated figure bearing Michelangelo's own features. Another significant piece, the Pietà of Vittoria Colonna, exists as a chalk drawing, typical of presentation drawings Michelangelo would give to friends or patrons. This drawing shows the Virgin Mary with arms raised in a prophetic gesture, a pose reminiscent of Masaccio's depiction of the Holy Trinity. The Florentine Pietà reveals a deeper personal connection, portraying Michelangelo himself as Nicodemus, who assists in lowering Christ from the cross, supported by Mary Magdalene. Michelangelo famously damaged this statue, breaking Christ's left arm and leg in a moment of frustration, but it was later repaired by one of his students, one Tiberio Calsagni. His final work, the Rondanini Pietà, remains unfinished, its form reduced so drastically that parts of the original marble block, the legs and the arm, were left completely detached. This last sculpture embodies a stark and almost abstract quality that aligns with modern sculptural aesthetics. Michelangelo passed away in Rome on February the 18th, 1564, at the ripe old age of 88, a very good innings for the 16th century. Now, true to his wishes, he was buried in Florence at the Basilica of Santa Croce, a city that had long fueled his creative spirit. His tomb, a grand affair designed by Giorgio Vasari and financed by Michelangelo's nephew, Leonardo, no, not that Leonardo, was generously supported by Cosimo de' Medici, the Duke of Tuscany. And this wasn't a quick build either. In fact, it took them over 14 years to complete it, and it involved considerable expense. But this just reflects the high esteem in which Michelangelo was held, and there was plenty of donations coming in from all sides. It didn't matter how long it was going to take, they were going to get it done, and to a standard that would make Michelangelo happy. The state even organized a funeral in Florence to honor the legacy of this unparalleled artist, in which many people showed up to mourn. Perhaps they would never see another Michelangelo again, at least in their lifetimes. But the Renaissance is certainly not short of its interesting figures. I think there's plenty more of them left to talk about. And of course, if you want to hear about stuff like that, well, you're in the right place, aren't you? Leonardo da Vinci, 1452 to 1519, was a towering figure of the Italian Renaissance, known not only as being an artist, but an inventor and a scientist whose curiosity spanned multiple disciplines. Beyond painting, he filled notebooks with engineering sketches, fascinating scientific diagrams, and anatomical studies, which all reflect his relentless pursuit of knowledge and innovative approaches to understanding the world. His legacy extends beyond the realm of art. His visionary inventions and discoveries in fields such as anatomy, optics, and hydraulics anticipated many modern technologies. So, let's learn about his life today. Hello and welcome to the channel. If you're coming back, it's good to see you again. And if you're completely new, then it's good to meet you. If you'd like to support the channel, links to the Patreon are in description. Otherwise, if you like the video, you'll certainly have my heartfelt thanks. This helps YouTube push it out to a broader audience. Thank you in advance for liking the video. Now, let's get on with it. The life of Leonardo da Vinci. Please, make yourself comfortable. Leonardo da Vinci, born Leonardo di Ser Piero da Vinci, was born on April 15th, 1452, either in or near the Tuscan hill town of Vinci, approximately 20 miles from Florence. He was the illegitimate son of a man named Piero da Vinci, a Florentine legal notary, and Caterina de' Meo Lippi, who hailed from the lower class. Now, the exact location of his birth remains a little bit uncertain, but according to a traditional account recorded by the historian Emanuele Rapetti, he was born in Anciano, a secluded country hamlet that provided the privacy for his illegitimate birth. However, some speculate that he may have been born in a house in Florence that belonged to San Piero. Now, following Leonardo's birth, his parents married other individuals and went their separate ways. Caterina, identified as Caterina Buti del Vaca, married a local artisan named Antonio di Piero Buti del Vaca. Ser Piero married Albiera Amadori, whom he had been betrothed to the previous year. After Albiera's death in 1464, Ser Piero went on to marry 3 more times. Well, Leonardo himself grew up alongside 16 half-siblings, of whom 11 survived infancy. However, he had very little contact with them, as they were much younger than him, with the last being born when Leonardo was 46. And in terms of his childhood, very little concrete information exists, and much of what is known is obscured by myth, in part due to Giorgio Vasari's biography in Lives of the Most Excellent Painters, Sculptors, and Architects, originally released in 1550, which often contains rather apocryphal stories. Gotta sell some books, right? Now, there is tax records that indicate Leonardo lived in his paternal grandfather Antonio da Vinci's household by at least 1457. But it's possible he spent his early years under the care of his mother in Vinci, either in Anciano or Camposepi in the parish of San Pantaleone. He likely had a close relationship with his uncle, Francesco da Vinci, but his father, Ser Piero, was likely in Florence most of the time. Now, Ser Piero, belonging to a long line of notaries, established a residence in Florence by at least 1469, and enjoyed a fairly successful career. Despite his family's background, Leonardo received only a basic and comparatively informal education, focusing primarily on vernacular writing, reading, and mathematics. It's speculated, however, that his family did recognize his artistic talents earlier on and decided to prioritize them. But we don't know how this was done. It's simply suggested in the works of Giorgio Vasari. Well, in his later years, Leonardo recorded his earliest memory in the Codex Atlanticus. He recounted an incident from his infancy when a kite came to his cradle and opened his mouth with its tail. There's ongoing debate among commentators about whether this anecdote was an actual memory or simply a fantasy. Well, by the mid-1460s, Leonardo's family relocated to Florence, which was then a hub of Christian humanist thought and also cultural activity. At around the age of 14, he began working as a garzone, or studio boy, in the workshop of Andrea del Verrocchio, the leading painter and sculptor in Florence at the time. This period coincided with the death of Donatello, Verrocchio's master. Leonardo progressed to become an apprentice by the age of 17, and continued his training under Verrocchio for 7 years. Notable artists who either apprenticed in Verrocchio's workshop or were associated with it include Ghirlandaio, Perugino, Botticelli, and Lorenzo di Credi. Also, if I pronounce any of the Italian names wrong, I do apologize, and I mean no disrespect. I'm doing my very best with them. Thank you for your patience. Well, during his time with Verrocchio, Leonardo received comprehensive training in both theoretical principles and practical skills. Verrocchio really took him under the wing, and it was time to turn this young lad into a Renaissance man. He learned various technical disciplines, such as drafting, metalworking, chemistry, plaster casting, mechanics, woodworking, and leatherworking, in addition to artistic techniques like drawing, painting, sculpting, and modeling. Very busy schedule indeed. Leonardo was contemporaneous with renowned artists like the aforementioned Botticelli, Ghirlandaio, and Perugino, though they were slightly older than him. He likely encountered them also at the workshop of Verrocchio, or perhaps at the Platonic Academy of the Medici. Florence boasted numerous artworks by artists such as Masaccio and Ghiberti, whose works displayed realism, emotion, and intricate architectural backgrounds. Piero della Francesca's studies in perspective and scientific examination of light also influenced Leonardo's own artistic development. In Verrocchio's workshop, much of the painting was executed by assistants. According to Vasari, Leonardo collaborated with Verrocchio on the Baptism of Christ, showcasing his superior skill in painting the angel holding Jesus' robe. And if you haven't seen it, really, go and have a look. It's a beautiful painting. It is said that Verrocchio was so taken back and impressed by Leonardo's talent that he himself decided to simply give up painting. Although this is probably just an apocryphal story. Could have happened though. Leonardo may have also served as a model for some of Verrocchio's works, such as the bronze statue of David and the archangel Raphael in Tobias and the Angel. Vasari recounts a story from Leonardo's youth, when a local peasant requested a shield to be painted. Leonardo, inspired by the tale of Medusa, created a terrifying image of a monster spitting fire. Well, apparently, the shield was so impressive that his father decided to keep it for himself and sold a different one back to the peasant. Leonardo's painting was eventually sold to a Florentine art dealer for 100 ducats, who then sold it to the Duke of Milan. Now, by 1472, at the age of 20 years old, he had already done so much, and he was getting good at absolutely everything. You know, one of those people who just seem to not make any mistakes, who just seem to breeze through. In my country, we call them a Terry Too Good. He was certainly one of them. And by this age of 20, he achieved the status of master in the Guild of St. Luke, the esteemed guild of artists and doctors of medicine. Despite being established in his own workshop by his father, he maintained a strong attachment to Verrocchio, continuing to collaborate and live in with him. Leonardo's earliest known dated work, a pen and ink drawing from the Arno Valley of 1473, showcases some very early talent. Vasari credits Leonardo with being the first to propose the idea of making the Arno River navigable between Florence and Pisa as well. It's just another little idea that he had while he was down there. Moving on to January 1478, when Leonardo received an independent commission to paint the altarpiece for the chapel of St. Bernard in the Palazzo Vecchio, indicating his growing independence from Verrocchio's studio. An anonymous biographer, Anonimo Gadiano, claims that in 1480 Leonardo was residing with the Medici and frequented the garden of Piazza San Marco, where a Neoplatonic academy organized by the Medici gathered. In the March of 1481 he received another commission from the monks of San Donato in Scopeto for the Adoration of the Magi. However, both of these initial projects were abandoned when Leonardo decided to offer his services to the Duke of Milan, Ludovico Sforza. Leonardo wrote Sforza a letter detailing his skills in engineering, weapon design, and painting, and he presented the Duke with a unique silver string instrument shaped like a horse's head, which was most likely either a lute or a kind of lyre. Through his association with Alberti, Leonardo gained access to the home of the Medici, where he became acquainted with the prominent humanist philosopher, such as Marsiglio Ficini, Cristoforo Landino, and John Argyropoulos. He also interacted with the brilliant young poet and philosopher Pico del Mirandola. Back in 1482, Leonardo was sent as an ambassador by Lorenzo de' Medici to Ludovico il Moro, the ruler of Milan from 1479 to 1499. And this was a very significant turning point in Leonardo's career, as he sought new opportunities and patronage in the city of Milan. During his time in Milan from 1482 to 1499, Leonardo undertook several significant commissions and projects. He was commissioned to create masterpieces such as the Virgin on the Rocks for the Confraternity of the Immaculate Conception, and the Last Supper for the monastery of Santa Maria del Grazie. In the spring of 1485, Leonardo traveled to Hungary on behalf of Ludovico Sforza to meet King Matthias Corvinus, who commissioned him to paint a Madonna. Additionally, in 1490 he served as a consultant, alongside Francesco di Giorgio Martini, for the construction of the Cathedral of Pavia, where he was inspired by the equestrian statue of Regisol, leaving behind a sketch. Leonardo worked on various projects for Sforza, including floats and pageants for special occasions, a drawing and wooden model for a competition to design the cupola for Milan Cathedral, and a model for a colossal equestrian monument to Ludovico's predecessor, Francesco Sforza, known as the Gran Cavallo. Although Leonardo completed a model for the horse and detailed plans for its castings, Ludovico diverted the metal intended for the statue to build a cannon to defend the walls from Charles VIII of France in November 1494. I mean, priorities, right? Additionally, contemporary correspondence reveals that Leonardo and his assistants were tasked by the Duke of Milan to to paint the Sala del Assai in Sforza Castle around 1498. This project involved creating a trompe-l'oeil decoration that transformed the Great Hall into a pergola, featuring intertwined mulberry trees with an intricate canopy of leaves and knots in the ceiling, showcasing Leonardo's mastery of perspective and also illusionistic techniques. After Ludovico Sforza was ousted by France in 1500, Leonardo fled for Venice, accompanied by his assistant Salai and the mathematician Luca Pacioli. In Venice, he worked as a military architect and engineer, devising defensive strategies against naval attacks. Upon returning to Florence in 1500, Leonardo and his household were hosted by the Servite monks at the monastery of Santissima Annunziata, where he created the cartoon of the Virgin and Child of Saint Anne and St. John the Baptist, which garnered immense and widespread admiration. In 1502, Leonardo entered the service of Cesare Borgia, the son of Pope Alexander VI, serving as a military architect and engineer. He traveled throughout Italy with Borgia, creating maps of strategic locations and designing structures such as dams. Leonardo left Borgia's service and returned to Florence in the early of 1503, rejoining the Guild of St. Luke and commencing work on the iconic portrait of Lisa del Giocondo, also known as the Mona Lisa. In 1504, he participated in a committee to decide the placement of Michelangelo's statue of David. He then spent the next 2 years in Florence working on the mural of the Battle of Anghiari for Signoria, alongside Michelangelo's The Battle of Cascina. By 1506, Leonardo was summoned back to Milan by Charles II d'Amboise, the French governor. While there, he took on Count Francesco Melzi as a pupil. Despite the Council of Florence's desire for him to return and finish the work of the Battle of Anghiari, Leonardo was granted leave by Louis XII of France to work on various projects, including a potential equestrian figure of d'Amboise. During his time in Milan, many prominent pupils, such as Bernardino Luini and Giovanni Antonio Bolterafio, studied or collaborated with him. By this time he was certainly becoming a teacher, and many people sought out his advice, whether it be for artistic pursuits or otherwise. In 1507, Leonardo was forced to travel back to Florence, and not on an artistic mission, but rather to resolve a dispute with his brothers over his recently deceased father's estate. By 1508, he returned to Milan, where he resided in his own house in Porta Orientale, in the parish of Santa Bibola. 4 years later, Leonardo began working on plans for an equestrian monument for Gian Giacomo Trivulzio, but these plans were halted due to an invasion by a confederation of Swiss, Spanish, and Venetian forces, which drove the French from Milan. Despite the turmoil, Leonardo remained in the city, spending time in 1513 at the Medici's Vaprio di Ada villa. In March of 1513, Lorenzo de' Medici's son Giovanni became Pope Leo X, Leonardo then travelled to Rome in September of the same year, where he was received by the Pope's brother, Giuliano. He spent much of his time living in the Belvedere courtyard in the Apostolic Palace, alongside Michelangelo and Raphael. Leonardo received a monthly allowance from the Pope and was engaged in various projects, including decorating a lizard with quicksilver-coated scales and working on plans for draining the Pontine marshes. He also dissected cadavers and took notes for his anatomical studies. In the October of 1515, some 2 years later, King Francis I of France recaptured Milan, and Leonardo was present at the meeting between Francis I and Leo X in December of that year. In 1516, Leonardo entered Francis's service and was given the use of the manor house Clos-Luc near the king's residence at the royal Château d'Amboise. He drew plans for a castle town at Ramorantin and created a mechanical lion for a pageant attended by the king. During this period, Leonardo was accompanied by his friend and apprentice, Francesco Melzi, and received a pension. At some point, Melzi had drawn a portrait of Leonardo, and there are other sketches and records from this time, including accounts of Leonardo being paralyzed in his right hand. Not good for an artist. Well, despite the health issues, he continued to work until he became bedridden for several months. And then Leonardo da Vinci passed away at Clos-Luce on May 2nd, 1519, at the age of 67 and possibly due to a stroke. His close friend, King Francis I, was with him in his final moments, and according to Vasari, Leonardo expressed remorse for not fully dedicating himself to his art. He received the last rites and confession before passing away. Legend has it that King Francis himself cradled Leonardo's head as he breathed his last breath, and his funeral procession included 60 beggars carrying tapers, as per his will. He left his belongings to his principal heir and executor, Francesco Melzi, including his paintings, tools, library, and some personal effects. Melzi's companions, Salai and Baptista de Villanis, also received their shares of Leonardo's estate. His remains were interred at the Collegiate Church of Saint Florentine at the Château d'Amboise. 20 years after his death, King Francis I remarked on his unparalleled knowledge, not only in the arts, but also in philosophy. Leonardo's longtime assistant, Salai, remained in his household, despite his misdemeanors, and executed paintings under the name Andrea Salai, which you can look up and take a look at. They're pretty good. Although Leonardo taught him much about painting, Salai's work is considered of lesser quality than that of other students. And at the time of his death, in 1524, Salai owned a painting referred to as Gioconda, which was valued highly in a posthumous inventory of his belongings. But we're not here to learn about Salai, aren't we? Let's hear a little bit more about the personal life of Leonardo. And of course, a lot of it's going to come from Vasari, so don't be too surprised. While Leonardo was depicted by his early biographers as, of course, a man possessing extraordinary personal charm, generosity, and also kindness towards everyone he met, he was widely admired by his contemporaries, with Vasari noting that, and I quote, Leonardo's disposition was so lovable that he commanded everybody's affection. He was also known for his wit in conversation, and he could apparently easily captivate others with the written word. Vasari offers another summarization of his character, stating, "His impressive presence brought solace to the troubled souls. He possessed such persuasive abilities that he could sway others to his will. He was exceedingly generous, ensuring that all his friends, regardless of their wealth, were well taken care of. His birth was a great boon to Florence, and his death left an immeasurable void." Here's another quote from Vasari. "In the ordinary course of events, many individuals are born with various talents and qualities. However, on occasion a person is endowed by nature in such abundance that they surpass all others. Leonardo da Vinci was widely acknowledged as one such individual, possessing not only remarkable physical beauty, but also an infinite grace in his endeavors. His genius was so profound that he effortlessly resolved any challenges he encountered. While working on the Last Supper, Leonardo had reportedly said, 'Wine may be enjoyable, but water is preferable at the table. Small living spaces steer the mind in the right direction, while large ones lead it astray. Pursuing wealth excessively often results in a lack of enjoyment.' He also penned the words, 'Those who seek quick riches often meet swift downfall.' Think about that one. Not bad. Now, Leonardo's philosophical musings were also evident in a series of fables he crafted for Ludovico Sfora's court. Presented as jests labeled prophecies, these tales often warned against the perils of arrogance, emphasizing the virtues of humility, awareness, and diligence. Leonardo's playful side was apparent in his practical jokes, such as surprising acquaintances with a lizard adorned in those extravagant decorations crafted from quicksilver. In his treatise on painting, he even described a humorous trick involving setting a hall ablaze using incense smoke and a lit torch. I'm sure they didn't find that very humorous. Perhaps it's all subjective, just like art, right? Well, his personal life and his sexuality remain enigmatic. He left behind very little personal correspondence or documentation of romantic interests. Despite his extensive writings, there are no letters, no poems, and no diaries that indicate any romantic relationships at all. He never married, and it cannot be definitely stated whether he had intimate relationships with anyone, regardless of gender. Well, it certainly seems that he was dedicated to his work. He'd make a great Warhammer 40k hobbyist, I tell you that. However, art historian Raymond Stites suggested a romantic involvement with the one Cecilia Gallerani, the subject of his painting Lady with an Ermine. But of course, this is just speculation again. It could be just to simply fill in a gap within the information. Somebody wanted to write something to sort of give it some kind of explanation. So we don't really know. Now, we have a few little references to sexuality in general from his notebooks, which actually reflects somewhat of a negative and almost Puritan view. And it seems a little bit strange. And I'll read one of the quotes for you, and it goes like this. "The act of procreation, and anything that has any relation to it, is so disgusting that human beings would soon die out if there were no pretty faces and sensuous dispositions." Another quote suggests a preference for intellectual passion over sensuality. And it goes like this. "Intellectual passion drives out sensuality. Whoso curbs not lustful desires puts himself on a level with the beasts." Yikes. Well, it certainly explains why all of his pursuits were so thoroughly pursued. Perhaps he had quite a lot of free time. And it certainly makes you wonder about this alleged romantic involvement with Cecilia Gallerani that the historian Raymond Stites had suggested. If there was a romantic involvement, well, it seems that it may have been a little bit lukewarm, unless these quotes were just writings of a man who was having a bad day. Who knows? Now, the only historical record concerning Leonardo's sexual life is actually an accusation of sodomy that was made against him in 1476, when he was nearly 24 years old and still an apprentice in Verrocchio's workshop. The accusation, however, is dismissed due to insufficient evidence, which I don't know how you would find sufficient evidence of it, but it still remains a topic of speculation among scholars. Now, throughout history, the interpretations of his sexuality have varied. Some biographers suggest that he was actually homosexual, while others believe that he was simply celibate for much of his life. Elizabeth Abbott posited that the sodomy case could have traumatized him into celibacy. Perhaps so, maybe there's something to that. And guess who? Sigmund Freud actually put his 2 cents in, and he suggested a latent homosexuality, while others argue that he was actively homosexual. Evidence for it includes a comic illustration from 1495 and an erotic drawing of his assistant Sally. So why was he drawing things like that? Really makes you think. But the interpretations of these artworks and their significance in relation to Leonardo's sexuality, once again, it's all debatable. And despite the speculation, his personal life continues to be a subject of fascination, but also inquiry. Me? I personally think that it is perhaps a part of our modern historical revisionism, where we try and look at figures of the past and fit them into a box where it could perhaps represent our own personal inclinations. It's the same thing that happens with a lot of the Greek figures and lots of different people who simply did not want to get married. I think that if anything, we could perhaps put him into a category of asexual, just simply not interested. I mean, he was certainly busy enough with all of his projects, and I think that's probably what it was, and that's just my personal opinion. I think he just wanted to be left alone to do his art. Now, moving on from that, Vasari portrays Leonardo da Vinci's childhood as marked by exceptional talent, but also a restless curiosity. Despite being easily distracted, reportedly, he had showed remarkable progress in his studies, particularly in arithmetic. Throughout his youth, he had reportedly never ceased drawing, and his innate artistic abilities continued to improve. Recognizing his son's extraordinary talents, Leonardo's father took some of his drawings to Andrea del Verrocchio, that prominent artist, and that's how he got into the apprenticeship. He also learned while he was there to be a skilled geometrician, and Vasari notes that during his apprenticeship he crafted clay heads of smiling women and children, which remained popular even decades later. Now his early works, such as the Annunciation in the Uffizi, and his collaboration with Verrocchio on the baptism of Christ, certainly do exemplify this emerging talent. His diverse interests, evident since childhood, are reflected in his journals, where he meticulously documented his scientific observations, experiments, and even his creative writing, including fables. It can't all be science, can't it? Now, regarding religion, although there is limited first-hand information about Leonardo's beliefs, historians generally consider him to be Catholic. He viewed God as a supreme being and expressed interest in Greek philosophy, particularly Plato and Aristotle. He respected religious texts like the Bible, while also questioning certain biblical narratives, such as the story of Noah's flood. But he also criticized pagan mythology, dismissing the notion of gods as celestial bodies and describing them as mortal and corrupt. According to Vasari, his musical talents were also evident from a young age, as he learned to play the lyre and demonstrated remarkable improvisational skills. Around 1479, he even crafted a lyre in the shape of a horse head, primarily made of silver, and it reportedly produced a very rich and resonant sound. When Lorenzo de' Medici sought to improve relations with Ludovico Sforza, the Duke of Milan, this was the lyre that Leonardo presented as a gift. In fact, his musical abilities reportedly outshone those of the court musicians, which greatly impressed the Duke. Additionally, it is believed that Leonardo was proficient in keyboard instruments like the virginal, and one of his inventions, the viola organista, was based on his designs from notebooks dating 1488 to 89 and the Codex Atlanticus. The instrument featured keys that, when pressed, caused strings to interact with rotating rosin-covered wheels. And just lastly, Leonardo's profound love for nature stemmed from his childhood surroundings, which included mountains, forests, rivers, and diverse wildlife. His exploration of the natural world influenced his interest in painting. His compassion for animals was also notable, as he questioned the morality of meat consumption when not essential for health. Both contemporary accounts and his notebooks document this love for animals, and it led to widespread belief that he was actually a vegetarian. He often freed caged birds he encountered for sale in Florence, paying for their release and allowing them to fly away. This empathy for animals and aversion to causing unnecessary suffering contributed to this vegetarian lifestyle. In his notebooks, Leonardo expressed concern for the well-being of animals in general, and critiqued the practice of consuming meat, advocating for compassion and ethical treatment of all living creatures. And with that, we end our talk on Leonardo da Vinci. I hope you enjoyed it. Bit of a different one today. I don't often do biographies, but it's fun. I would like to thank my Mega Chat tier patrons, Jeffrey, JC, and Stark Factory. Thank you very much, lads. And if you'd like to become a member of the Patreon, you need only follow the links in the description. Otherwise, thank you very much for joining me once more, and I will see you in the next video. Good night. Take care.